Hello my friends, in today's video we will be comparing Fujifilm X-T4 and Panasonic GH5. Panasonic GH5 has been around for more than 3 years now and it is one of the most popular mirrorless cameras, especially for video. Fujifilm is now also very serious about the video. They've basically completed and rounded up their X-T package in the 4th generation with the addition of in-body image stabilization, larger battery and so on. Panasonic GH5 was significantly improved by firmware updates, so it is kind of GH5.5 at this point. In this video I will try to explain how you should, in my opinion, decide between these two. Starting with the physical aspects, the X-T4 is a bit wider and the GH5 is a bit thicker, but overall I didn't notice size difference in practical use. GH5 is heavier by about 120 grams. Both are very well made cameras. Both use magnesium frame and I would say that it is a draw in terms of the build quality. Panasonic has better doors with hinges and more solid rotating screen mechanism. Fuji has nicer rubberized surface. I think that Fujifilm looks better because I really like the vintage style cameras, but that is a personal preference. The first difference between these cameras is the sensor. X-T4 uses 26.1 megapixel APS-C sensor. This is very modern backside illuminated sensor. Panasonic uses 20.2 megapixel micro four thirds sensor. By 2020 standards, it is an OK sensor. It is smaller and there is no backside illumination, so it is also technologically less advanced. And the difference is visible. Fujifilm is significantly better when it comes to dynamic range. GH5 will be fine in majority of situations. If you want to shoot HDR scenes such as sunsets, there will be a lot more noise in shadows on the GH5. X-T4 gives you more option for editing or recovering your pictures, so it clearly wins in terms of dynamic range. Regarding the ISO, X-T4 is about 1.25 stop cleaner up to ISO 3200. That means that the ISO 3200 on X-T4 is still a little bit cleaner than ISO 1600 on GH5. Similarly, ISO 6400 on X-T4 looks a little bit better than ISO 3200 on GH5. GH5 is generally usable up to ISO 1600 or 3200 depending on the dynamic range of the scene. ISO 6400 is an emergency option. ISO 12800 can only be used for low dynamic range scenes and low resolution publishing, otherwise it falls apart. X-T4 is actually OK up to ISO 6400, which is very impressive for APS-C. At ISO 12800 you can clearly see the noise, but it still gets the color right, so it can be somewhat usable for scenes with lower dynamic range. Basically, the only advantage of GH5 sensor is that it can do full sensor readout at 60p. That means that it can shoot no crop 4K 60p. Fujifilm can also shoot 4K 60p, but with 1.18 times crop. Overall, the X-T4 wins in terms of the sensor performance by a significant margin. The color science on both is quite different. Fuji X-Trans 4 cameras are some of the most accurate on the market. It produces realistic, toned-down colors in default Provia setting. GH5 produces more contrasty, saturated and warmer colors. Personally, I like accurate colors, so I prefer Fujifilm. For me, it is much easier to work with in video, but I will get to that later. For RAWs, it is not that big of a deal and I am quite fine with both. Both sensors have very high pixel density, which means that you need very high quality lenses to match the resolution of both. X-T4 has more resolution and also lower pixel density, so if you want to capture the highest amount of detail for fine printing, it will be a better choice. GH5 was always more oriented towards the video usage and it has great video capabilities even by 2020 standards. Fujifilm is now also very interested in video market, so let's take a look at the video capabilities of both. Both cameras can shoot downsampled 4K up to 30p with no crop in 10-bit internally, which is great. Fuji can shoot DCI in any mode. GH5 can only shoot DCI in 24p. The amount of detail on both cameras is really nice. X-T4 has an edge though, mostly because of the higher downsampling rate and lower pixel density. That gives it a bit less digital look. GH5 still shoots beautiful 4K video, of course. Fujifilm shoots compressed 10-bit 420 internally, GH5 shoots 422. 200 megabits per second long GOP files from X-T4 are still a little bit easier to work with than 150 megabits per second GH5 files. Both cameras can shoot 400 megabits per second all intra, but the IPB on both cameras is so good that it makes very little difference. Both cameras can shoot 4K 60p, which is great. GH5 can shoot 4K 60 using the full sensor with no crop, but only in 8-bit. X-T4 has 1.18 times crop, but it can shoot 10-bit 4K 60 internally. If you use external recorder, both can shoot unlimited 4K 60p 10-bit 422. A huge strength of Fuji in video is Eterna film simulation. That is my most favorite semi-flat picture style of any camera, and it works great with 10-bit footage. On the GH5 I was never able to find ideal semi-flat profile. Cine-like decolors are too off and there is no flat profile like on the S line. Natural with everything set to -5 works quite well, but I have to say that I much prefer Eterna on Fuji. To sum up the video capabilities, I would say that Fuji has now surpassed Panasonic. It has a bit less digital and more filmic look, I prefer Fuji colors, and the files from Fuji are also easier to work with. On the other hand, it has that 1.18 times crop in 4K 60 and also recording limit of 30 minutes. Panasonic has no crop and no limit. Both are great video cameras, and for video you can't go really wrong with either. To take a break from the technical stuff, let's talk a bit about the handling. The short summary is that Panasonic has more practical controls and better ergonomy, whereas the Fuji has more engaging but less practical analog style controls. The grip is much larger and more comfortable on the GH5. As I have said before, Fuji grip is not as bad as it appears to be, and it is fine to use with small to medium sized lenses. GH5 actually has great grip. X-T4 has signature ISO and shutter speed dials, whereas the GH5 has more common mode dial. Which option is better for you is a matter of preference. A big advantage for me personally is the still/video mode switch on the Fuji. It lets me have separate settings for stills and video and switch between those very quickly. I use very different settings for stills and video, so that is quite important for me. Both have enough custom buttons for all of the important settings. I prefer the position of autofocus drive on the backside, which is the case with the GH5. On the other hand, I don't like the position of the display button on the GH5, which is very easy to press accidentally. Regarding the autofocus, the best summary is that it depends. In stills, both are more than good enough for normal usage. The focus acquisition is basically instant on both. Fuji has a slight advantage in low light. It is also a bit better for tracking fast-moving subjects. Having said that, GH5 is more than sufficient for vast majority of situations. Sometimes you may still get this pulsing, which doesn't affect the photos, but it is distracting. In video, if you use the right lenses on Fuji, such as 23mm f2 or 16-80, the autofocus can be really great. It can even do this close distance to infinity focusing with no hunting at all. Eye tracking in video is also very impressive with the X-T4. If you use older lenses such as f1.4 primes, there might be hunting. As I've said in many videos before, GH5 autofocus is really good with firmware 2.6. The speed, responsiveness and the accuracy is no longer a problem. The problem is only the last bit of hunting in difficult situations, which will give away that it is still contrast-based autofocus. Face tracking isn't quite as smooth, but it is still very reliable. An advantage of the GH5 are area mode settings and touch tracking. On X-T4 you can only have multi or wide setting and single point setting. There is no touch tracking, which means that this impressive tracking sample with the GH5 is not possible to make with the X-T4. Overall, I would say that Fuji still wins in terms of the autofocus. It is smoother and more responsive with the right lenses, better in stills, but it lacks the area settings. The in-body image stabilization is probably the biggest improvement on the X-T4 over the X-T3. The efficiency is actually very similar to the GH5. At 16mm, I was able to get sharp pictures up to about 1 second on both, which is a good result, and it helps a lot in the low light. In video, it is also very effective on both. In-body image stabilization on its own is more than sufficient for holding the camera still or for panning. In-body image stabilization can also work with optical stabilization in the lenses on both cameras. The efficiency is again similar. That means that it is sufficient even for more challenging situations. Dual stabilization is very effective at 70mm full frame equivalent. Both cameras are very suitable for handheld shooting. Honestly, I can't really say which one is better, so I will say that it is a draw. Panasonic definitely wins in terms of the user interface. It has simpler menu, which can be fully controlled using the touchscreen. Fuji menu is not entirely bad, it is quite well structured, but not as well as with the Panasonic. You also can't control it at all using the touchscreen. The EVF and the screen are basically the same on both. Both use very nice, sharp and color accurate 3.68 million dot viewfinder. GH5 has 0.76 times magnification, X-T4 has 0.75 times magnification. X-T4 can go up to 100 Hz though, so that is an advantage of the X-T4. The screen size is 3.2 inches on the GH5 and 3 inches on the X-T4. Both have the same resolution of 1.62 million dots, which is very good. Overall, both are really good screens, so I have no complaints. Both are fully rotating screens. I have already talked a lot about that, so I think that it is great for the internet. Personally, I don't like rotating screens at all, again for the following reasons, but I have to acknowledge that it is a matter of opinion. X-T4 can shoot 15 frames per second with autofocus continuous and mechanical shutter, and up to 20 frames per second with autofocus continuous and electronic shutter, and 30 frames per second with electronic shutter and crop. That means that it is significantly faster than the GH5, which can only shoot 9 frames per second with autofocus continuous and mechanical shutter. Together with a better tracking, it makes the X-T4 more suitable camera for fast action. The battery life is better on X-T4. GH5 is rated for 410 shots, X-T4 is rated for 600 shots. In reality, Fuji is better probably by 30% for hybrid usage. The battery life is still very good on both. A big advantage of X-T4 is that it can be charged through USB-C using fast power delivery protocol. GH5 can't charge the batteries in camera at all. Regarding the lens selection, an advantage of Fujifilm is that they have red batch f2.8 zoom lenses, which can give you f4 full frame equivalent. On Micro Four Thirds, you can only have f5.6 full frame equivalent zoom lenses, with the exception of 10 to 25mm f1.7. That is a very special lens which can give you full frame results, but also with full frame size and price. Fuji has some very nice f2 primes which I really like. I also like the new 16 to 80mm f4 zoom, which is very solid all-round lens. They also have some specialty lenses such as 200mm f2 or MKX Cine lenses. Panasonic also has a lot of nice primes and really complete lens selection, unless you want super bright lenses to compensate for the crop. Of course, there are also Olympus lenses and Sigma primes. It really depends on what you are looking for, both have nice lens selection, but Micro Four Thirds still offer more choices. To sum up, I have to give the overall win to the Fujifilm X-T4, and here's why. The deal with high-end Micro Four Thirds cameras was they were able to take advantage of smaller sensor size to provide better feature set than similarly positioned cameras with larger sensor. Now they've let Fujifilm match or even surpass the feature set of the GH5 whilst using larger and technologically more advanced sensor. X-T4 arguably beats the GH5 in video, and the in-body image stabilization is just as good. The autofocus can already be very good with the right lenses, and it will likely be improved by firmware updates. The GH5 also isn't that much cheaper. GH5 has better ergonomy, user interface, and some smaller advantages such as smoother automatic exposure. It is not a bad camera by any means. If you have Panasonic GH5 for example, I still recommend it as an upgrade, but the overall winner of this comparison is Fujifilm X-T4. So that's it for this video, thank you for watching, I hope that you liked this video and that you found it to be useful. Stay tuned for more videos and maybe consider subscribing if you don't want to miss my future content. I appreciate your feedback in form of thumbs up or thumbs down. If you would like to ask anything or share your opinion, please do so in the comment section, and see you next time.